FirstAmendmentRadio.net.
Okay, welcome back to the Investigative Journal on this March 31st, 2015 day on our calendar. I'm your host, Greg Anthony. You're listening to FirstAmendmentRadio.com, and you can catch my show every Monday through Friday, 6 p.m. to 7 p.m. It's on FirstAmendmentRadio.com. Now, in the past years, I've covered stories showing a Vatican complicity in the genocides of the Native Americans in the mission schools run by the Jesuits, in the native schools run by the Jesuits in Canada. And those stories have really gone on deaf ears. When you look at the amount of people that were tortured and murdered, and then you look at the government response to that, you see a complicity between these private Catholic schools and the government. And a story that's gotten lost over the years has been named the Duplessis orphan story, and I covered that. And what that showed was Vatican CIA and North American government officials complicit in torture and murder of more than 100,000 children, known as the Duplessis orphans. Now, many people close to this case called it a crime of the century, and another Canadian Holocaust by Rod Vanneau, whose wife was a child victim who escaped. Now, he added that the Vatican and CIA are still covering up the mass murder of children. Now, I've interviewed Rod Vanneau many times, lives in Canada, and what happens with this story? Well, I'm going to go back to March 15, 2007, when I wrote extensively on this story, and it's gone on deaf ears again. Everybody forgets about it, and when I bring this fact up, I get emails like, "Oh, why, Greg, are you bringing people down this Vatican rabbit hole? We all know it's our government. Oh, they may have some little thing to do with it, but you're just misleading people." Oh, I am? Well, listen to the Duplessis orphan story, and maybe you'll think twice about sending me those type of emails. Now, here's what I reported years ago, and Rod Vanneau and journalist Christine Hahn, and I'll get to her story later, are just a couple of the thousands of people speaking out. Now, this was going on in Canada just recently against the horrors that took place from the 1930s through the 1980s to a group of innocent children called the Duplessis orphans. Now, the name of the orphans originated from the former premier of Quebec, Maurice Duplessis, who, according to Vanneau, was instrumental in protecting the culprits within the Canadian mental institutions and Catholic orphanages, torturing and killing thousands of young children. Now, the despicable program, said Vanneau, was also a part of a CIA mind experimentation program, carried out under the cover of darkness, but with full knowledge and complicity from the Vatican, who knowingly provided children from Catholic-run orphanages. Here's what Vanneau had to tell us that's gone on deaf ears. I've written hundreds of letters to every imaginable higher official in the Vatican, in the Canadian government, and in the U.S., said Vanneau. He told me this, whose wife was one of these orphans who managed, by the grace of God, to escape at a young age. This is equivalent to the Canadian Holocaust. But everyone in the Vatican, in North American governments, and in the media is covering it up. And you don't think these people work together, folks? Now, Vanneau had been an activist for his wife's cause, as well as an estimated 3,000 Duplessis orphan survivors. Now just think about how many that didn't, who are now reaching middle or old age. And on my radio show, Vanneau talked plainly, in starkly graphic and horrific terms, telling the sad story of how thousands of children have been murdered and tortured as Vatican and government officials continue to turn a blind eye and not take responsibility. Of course, why should they, when they can get away with it? Vanneau told me also, he said, one victim who is now speaking out talked about how his job in the mental institution was to carry out the bodies of the dead children, throwing them like animals in a mass grave called the pigsty. Now, he added that the name of the mass grave acquired its name because it was right next to a pig farm. Quote, we estimate thousands of children were buried there on an 800-acre plot of ground in Montreal, where one of the mental institutions and Catholic orphanages once was located. Now, when the land was sold by the Catholic Church for other purposes, including a parking lot and expanding city highway system, workers accidentally dug up human bones, Vanneau told me. This find was then covered up by the government and the Vatican, who now own the property, saying the bones were those of animals. But the workers told the true story because it's hard to mistake finger, arm, and leg bones, which were clearly human. Now, why would the Vatican, if they're representing God on earth, cover this up or even be involved in it? It's because they're not what they say they are. Now, Vanneau, for 15 years, it's going on over 20 now, has been trying to get justice for the horrendous crimes committed against his wife and others. It's been a long, long, hard battle, a fight that looks like David versus Goliath, since the U.S. and Canadian governments, along with this Roman Vatican hierarchy, are battling him tooth and nail to keep his case quiet. And the reason for the government's barricade at revealing the truth is Vanneau's case opens a can of worms, exposing the government and Vatican-sanctioned torture and abuse of more than 100,000 children involved in legal psychiatric government-sanctioned experimentation programs. Now the question, I'm just going to add something here and just do an analogy. When I've covered the Tony Alamo story, you saw how 150 media outlets were quick to indict this man. What happened here is so much more grievous and heinous, and it's not been covered. Doesn't it tell you something? Doesn't it tell you, one, who's in control and who's really covering up for who? Well, of course it does. But like I said, people are comfortable with this deception. And so they also feel, well, what are we going to do? Well, maybe if you start understanding who these people are, we'll get somewhere. Now, Vanneau, and the reason, now Vanneau's wife, let me talk a little bit about the particulars of this story. Vanneau's wife, Clarina, was one of thousands of children experimented on during the 50s and 60s in what has been known as the Duplessis orphan case. She's seeking justice now for crimes including illegal mind-altering drug experimentation, physical beatings, torture with whips and chains, while being collared like a dog, ice-cold baths, sleep deprivation, and other crimes that shock the conscience. Now, Clarina's case is resurfaced by the hard work, for one reason, there's one independent freelance journalist named Christine Hahn who has spent 2 years of her life, and I remember having her on my show talking about this, with Vanneau and other victims, trying to document and bring to justice high-level officials and doctors and Vatican priests and nuns responsible for the horrendous child abuse involved in this case. All of these years of trying to get justice, I know for a fact the Vatican is involved and they have much power, said Vanneau. When I sent a letter to Pope John Paul II, I believe it was intercepted by Ratzinger at the time, who was the head of the Office of Inquisition, who is now the Pope. Nothing has ever been done And even if the Vatican is a good and holy place, why haven't they denounced the actions of the culprits involved? Our investigations also have found that more than 200,000 children, mostly from broken homes, without proper family attention, have been sold for money on the black market and shipped out, some in cardboard boxes, on ocean-going vessels headed for foreign ports. Vonneau added this about his wife's personal tragedy on a previous show that I did. He said, "We have been married for more than 40 years. But Clarina kept secret she was one of the Duplessis orphans until 1992. She came from a poor family and was turned over to the Catholic orphanage when she was 9 years old. Since we began researching her case, we found overnight her medical files were changed, and she was declared mentally ill for no reason by the Catholic orphanage. This was a systematic way of getting these orphans into the mental institutions by forging these documents, calling kids insane when they weren't, so they could be either tested upon, and many were killed. And at the age of 11, my wife was then transferred to a psychiatric clinic where she underwent torture and abuse until she was 17 years old, when she finally escaped. Her sister also was one of the Duplessis orphans, undergoing the same torture and abuse. But my wife and sister have been one of the lucky ones," said Vonneau. Over the years, even though the case has been sealed tight and we haven't been able to find an attorney willing to stand up against the government and the Vatican, information has surfaced that thousands of these children were killed during the illegal experimentation programs. In fact, there's a place near one of the psychiatric institutes next to the pig pen, remember what we're talking about, where investigators claim more than 2,000 children have been buried in a mass grave. Complicity with the Vatican and the government, but yet they will plaster all over the news the case of Tony Alamo when they have to find 3 or 4 girls over the period of 40 years that have been bribed and coerced to lie about him and to make him out to be a person of ill repute, when in fact they cover up crimes of murder on mass levels. And they're still allowed to own property. They're still allowed all of their schools. Kids are not taken and put in foster homes at Catholic schools. And they're given the prestige of kings when they come to America, when a pope comes here. What is wrong with that picture? Well, there's a move right now, said Vonneau, and this was going on years ago, and nothing's been done, so I might add. Whatever they tried to do has been blocked, to exhume the bodies, but no court in the land wants to touch this case. Oh, I wonder why. How many cases have I shown you on this show? Remember the one of Alpern v. Vatican Bank when they were caught red-handed in the Vatican was caught red-handed in the Croatian genocide, and attorneys for the victims of that genocide were bringing a case in the Ninth Circuit Court here in America to get reparations for these people. And the judges, in their infinite wisdom, dropped the case, saying that the Vatican Bank doesn't do business here. Oh my God, I don't know how much more evidence people need to understand this story, but we'll continue. So they've been trying to exhume these bodies, but courts, either in Canada, our neighbor, and America, won't do a darn thing. Now, Vonneau's fight for justice is a stark example of how officials in Canada, the U.S., and the Vatican have joined together with large drug companies to keep the truth from the public. For his efforts to vindicate his wife's name, as well as prevent further child experimentation, Vonneau has had his phone wiretapped, as well as being harassed and hounded by Canadian authorities. The reason for the crackdown on Vonneau is that Hahn's investigation, that's Christine Hahn, the journalist, into the horrendous crimes committed against Clarina and others can be traced to illegal CIA-funded mind control and drug experimentation programs performed by unscrupulous doctors, some with former Nazi Party affiliations, especially using the children as guinea pigs. Hahn said, since the ties go to high-level doctors and government officials in both countries, that's America and here, there has been a concerted effort to suppress her story, as well as people like Vanneau, who are trying to get to the truth. Now, although meticulously researched and documented, Hahn's investigative piece was rejected by all mainstream publications, as she had to settle for publication in an alternative outlet called the Freedom Magazine. And see, what they'll do then is they'll claim that it has no merit. They're all lies. You see, even the New York Times, the big newspapers won't cover. But when will people realize that none of this stuff ever gets in those papers, because that's the line they can't cross? The gig would be up. Now, recently, Vanneau outlined, what his main motives are in seeking justice for his wife and many other children abused by the illegal experimentation programs. Now, let's be straight here on what exactly went on. Kids would be rounded up as orphans, put in Catholic institutions, then they would be considered, and the nuns would sign off and the priests would sign off that these kids were insane, put in mental institutions, then experimented on, and basically they were, lost souls, right? Incredible. Criminal acts. He said this is one reason why he wants to get at this. Horrific criminal acts were done to thousands of innocent children here in Canadian soil, ranging from murders, tortures, disappearance of children, lobotomies, and experimental drugs, and falsely labeling thousands of innocent young children. From 1935 to 1975, and nobody has yet been held accountable for these criminal acts. That's just one thing that Vanneau is doing. And that's one of the reasons he's still trying to get to the truth here. In fact, he's written a book about it. And when I last talked to him, he speaks in French and English, and he wrote in French. He's trying to get it translated. But anyway, and no one's been held accountable for these acts. Thousands of orphans, he says, were falsely labeled mentally ill. And today this label still hangs heavy on the orphan's shoulders. This label has not been erased off these people. That's another reason he wants to try to do something. So these people had to live their life with these false tags labeled on them. And the Quebec government, he says, the College of Physicians of Quebec, the Roman Catholic Church of Quebec, the Quebec Public Trustee, and the federal government of Canada have not yet acknowledged the harm done to thousands of young children here in Quebec. He also wants to look for help their constitutional rights. He's stating that the Quebec government, in complicity with the Vatican and, of course, the help of the CIA and other underground groups, took away the Duplessis orphans' right to defend themselves in court of law since 1995. Although 4 members of Parliament stated that the orphans could take a lawyer at any time for their case, but it has been 11 years, that was 8 years ago, now that many orphans have been trying to get a lawyer for their case, but to no avail. He said, lawyer Daniel Leiter told me flatly that the Duplessis orphans case is locked shut tight since, and will always be that way. The Duplessis orphans have no constitutional rights, he says. Rights, it all boils down to a huge cover-up, said Vanneau. The Duplessis orphans are entitled to a real compensation from all parties mentioned above for lives ruined and still having to live today with the after effects of their horrific journey into a psychiatric hospital having been falsely labeled. The following stories also show, and I'm going over some of the ones that I printed in the past, further illustrate this horrific story that's been covered up to this day. Incredible, isn't it? And let's get into those stories. Mass graves of children found in Montreal. Another Duplessis orphan tells of being tortured as a child in CIA experimentation programs using Nazi doctors. Pierre Sampson, he must be close to 70 now, is calling for justice. and an open investigation to stop murder of innocent children in government-sponsored child experimentation programs. He says more than 50,000 children, some say over 100,000, said to be illegally experimented upon, but crooked officials on both sides of the border are blocking investigations. And I said a long time ago, another Duplessis orphan came forward with horror stories, including electroshock therapy, straitjacket sessions, and mind-altering drug injections after being subjected to illegal government experimentation programs as a young child, after being declared insane, when in fact he wasn't. Now, Pierce Sampson, 60, of Vancouver, Canada, endured these torturous programs for 6 long years until the age of 14 when he finally escaped. And remember, folks, many people never did escape. Many people died. But thousands of other Duplessis orphans weren't as lucky as investigators recently uncovered a mass grave outside of Montreal where the bones of hundreds of children are buried in a mass grave, called the pigsty since the gravesite is located next to a hog farm. Now, I remember Rod Bonneau, his wife, was also a child victim, and said a push back then was underway to exhume bodies, but nothing's ever been done. And Bonneau told us, he said, listen, I've been researching this for over 10 years. Must be now going on 20. And I want to get justice for these people. We have documentation proving the link among the CIA, the United States, the Canadian government, the Vatican, all of them willing accomplices to the illegal experimentation of children. Now, thousands of children have died. Thousands of others have endured great suffering, and there remains about 3,000 surviving victims that we know about. Those that have come forward, many I believe still haven't. What's even more astonishing is that the illegal experimentation is probably still taking place as we speak. Sampson, who went public for the first time in the United States on my show years ago, is one of tens of thousands of children who were reduced to experimental guinea pigs by unscrupulous doctors known as the Nazi war criminals in a CIA program started in the 50s. Now, we talked about this. We've talked about the Vatican rat lines in the past and how the Vatican worked to take these high-level Nazis and spread them out through the country, Brazil, America, etc. But nobody believes that anything is wrong with that. Right? That's why nobody's ever done anything about it, right? You can talk till the cows come home, but what really has been done? Now, recently, this was back almost 7-8 years ago. In looking back, a Canadian High Court in 2004 awarded damages to adult mind control victims in a related case, pinning the CIA with responsibility as well as their unscrupulous doctors, including Ewan Cameron. So this wasn't related to the orphans, but for a further look at Cameron's nefarious activities, a book called The Most Dangerous Games traces the history of top-secret CIA mind control operations, MKUltra programs, from the important importation of Nazi scientists at the end of World War II to the illegal brainwashing experiments conducted on the patients of psychiatric researcher Cameron. Now, the same type of testing Dr. Cameron and others performed on adults is now being traced to the innocent children as advocates for the Duplessis orphans contend that he was also involved. Now, regarding Sampson's personal story, he said at the age of 6, he was transferred from a Catholic orphanage to a mental institution, even though he was both mentally and physically sound, as church and civil authorities overnight changed his paperwork, indicating he was mentally ill. Now, after researching what happened, said Sampson, who also was on my show years ago talking about this, the church made a deal with the government to turn over perfectly healthy children in return for money, giving the doctors the ability to experiment at will since we were all considered insane. Back in 3 minutes on the Investigative Journal.
Hear it first on FirstAmendmentRadio.com and FirstAmendmentRadio.net. The program you are listening to is 100% sponsored by you, the listener, on this First Amendment Rights Media channel. You will notice that there are few commercials on this radio network. There's a good reason for that. Corporate advertising dollars come with strings that limit program content. So without your help, these programs cannot continue on internet or our several affiliates. If you benefit by the educational law programs, we ask you to give. If you are admonished or nurtured by the Bible and ministry programs, we ask you to give. If some voice a cause that you are passionate about, we ask you to give. If you believe in any of these, we ask you to support them as you would a missionary on a continual basis, as if giving a tithe for missionary radio. These programs are not commercially viable and must be supported by those faithful to the cause of truth. Look for the button to sponsor your favorite programs at our listen and schedule pages on the internet. Then, when you subscribe, we will send you the last quarterly MP3 CD of that program immediately, and continue to do so with each new quarter. We will also give you unlimited archive access to all of our programs. We're asking you to give much less than a tithe, so that you may also send support directly to a particular program host, cause, and anywhere else the Spirit may lead you. Do all to the glory of our God and Creator, for His holy nation, the only kingdom that will last forever. Thank you for listening. Since the beginning of time, kings have sought it, nations have fought for it. It has been traded, it has been borrowed, it has been purchased, it has been stolen. There's a reason for it. To secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and to our posterity. Invest with the security of gold and silver. Call Discount Gold and Silver Trading at 1-800-375-4188 or visit discountgoldandsilvertrading.net. Listen to Financial Survival with your host, Melody Cedarstrom, right here on FirstAmendmentRadio.com at 4 p.m. Eastern or 1 p.m. Pacific Time. Visit DiscountGoldandSilverTrading.net or call Discount Gold and Silver Trading at 1-800-375-4188. Toll free, 1-800-375-4188.
Okay, back for the second half hour. We're looking back on the Duplessis orphan story and this horrendous story that is still being covered up. And we're talking about a person who had a personal experience, Mr. Sampson. And he said that he was transferred at the age of 6 from a Catholic orphanage to a mental institution, even though he was both physically and mentally sound, as church and civil authorities overnight changed his paperwork, indicating he was mentally ill. And he told us, he said, listen, after researching what happened, and he appeared on my radio show, the church made a deal with the government to turn over perfectly healthy children in return for money, giving the doctors the ability to experiment at will since they were all considered insane. And he said to me, to this day my records still haven't been changed. Although I've never been mentally ill, my records still haven't been changed. The link Sampson makes between the infiltrated Catholic Church and corrupted civil authorities is disturbing, isn't it, to say the least, indicating a consolidation of corruption, not only in government, but extended all the way to Rome and beyond. Now, according to Vanneau and Sampson, this inhumane treatment was accomplished with full authority, cooperation, and funding of the American and Canadian governments, together with corrupted elements of the Catholic Church. One of the government's main suppliers of children used like little guinea pigs. And I remember what Rod told me. He said, I hope one day we can get justice and remove this evil element of people from the continent. How can we live in a society and trust a government or a church who is killing our own children? These people will never admit to what they've done, and the only thing we can do is gather enough support among good people to have these corrupted leaders outed. Now, he outlined his main motives, and I've talked about that in the past. And I remember making a note back then. I said, it's beyond human comprehension how newspaper owners in the mainstream lack the decency to mount an investigation for the memory of these dead children and the many others who have suffered at the hands of corrupted politicians and church leaders. By ignoring this story for more than 5 decades, major newspaper owners in the United States should be branded as co-conspirators, along with these corrupted church leaders and politicians, who all march to the altar in lockstep every Sunday with the blood of the Duplessis orphans dripping from their dirty hands. Now, I remember featuring Christine Hahn. Now, she wrote about this story. She was one of the brave journalists who tried to get the truth out. And I remember her telling me that none of the mainstream publications, even though meticulously documented, would touch this story, showing that they were in bed with the Vatican and the government. And I remember saying Christine Hahn was one of those journalists who doesn't take no for an answer. She looks below the surface for a story, won't tolerate being lied to, and considers the mainstream media a joke. That's what she told me. Hahn considers, quote, compromising the truth a mortal sin, and isn't afraid to tackle tough issues, controversial subjects, including how this Vatican CIA-funded program illegally experimented on more than 100,000 children in the 50s through the 80s. Now, she told me, and I have a quote here, stories have surfaced about illegal government experimentation on adults through programs like MKUltra. But I have meticulously documented the abuse going on amongst innocent children. Now, she was a Canadian, but she resided in the U.S., this was several years ago, who's also, she told me, she was threatened numerous times during her 2 years of researching this story. Further, Hahn's well-documented story, pinning government involvement and Vatican connections, involves influential doctors having Nazi ties. Finally it did appear, in an alternative publication called Freedom Magazine, after being suppressed by numerous mainstream outlets in the U.S. and Canada. Nobody wanted to touch the story, said Hahn, because of the high-level names. I also was working with W5, a well-known Canadian film documentary outlet, when I had my grant pulled as well as the project pulled. I found out the head of the Investigative Journalist Grant Program also had CIA connections. Hey, that reminds me, when I remember working in Rome, I found out the American newspaper there was funded by the CIA. The cover-up and media sellout is keeping vital information from the public, and is part of the problem facing us. Now, although Hahn's story was suppressed in Canada and the U.S., she didn't give up. No. Finally finding Freedom Magazine in L.A. as an outlet, explaining some of her frustrations behind the story, she said this. I remember, I'm going to quote her here. She said, like I said, I once worked for W5, a well-known Canadian current affairs program. Even though 2 of the 5 documentaries I helped produce were among the highest-rated shows of the season, my contract was not renewed after I started working on the Duplessis orphan story. I suspect it's because of the other stories I was exposing on a eugenics program involving the Duplessis orphans. I could not get any mainstream media publication to even touch my stories. So Freedom Magazine ran the piece. Through doing the story, I also have experienced firsthand how, despite having documented unbelievable crimes, including the fact that Canadian's Prime Minister Paul Martin's father was responsible for what happened to these orphans, you cannot get your work published anywhere. In an effort to get out the truth, I've decided to create my own website, put my stories on there, and advertise my services. Sounds familiar. It's really nice to see that there are other journalists out there, like you, Greg, who won't sell out for money and really care about the truth behind the Vatican. Referring to a recent article in the Arctic Beacon, that was my website, and it still is, about a victim of the Illuminati mind control programs named Maury. Hahn said, "Your recent interview with Maury really caught my attention because I have interviewed other survivors who were brought to Canada from the States as children and subjected to the exact same horrific experimentation as Maury. What's interesting is that hundreds of survivors recount the same experiences. They can't all be lying, and their stories need to be told despite the sensitivity and despite the resistance people have in believing their government. How could their government or the Vatican be involved in such things?" During Christine Hahn's research, she talked with numerous victims, acclaimed psychiatrists, and other experts, pinning the abuse on government-funded programs using unscrupulous doctors, some having former Nazi Party connections. And I've picked up that story from Freedom Magazine, and I'm sure it's still there. So go to Freedom Magazine. Maybe you still can get it. Maybe it's not. I don't even know if the magazine's alive and well now, but you might want to check. But here's some segments of her article. She said, children's advocate Carol Roots, author of The Nation Betrayed, told Freedom Magazine and myself, based on her research, the Duplessis orphans became prime subjects for psychiatric testing and abuse. These children, she said, were defenseless, easy prey for ruthless doctors, turned over by the Vatican, who inflicted pain and death under the guise of science. Many girls and boys, she said, had no parents to return home to, hence the extent of their abuse needed no cover-up. Who would tell? They could be beaten or drugged into submission. Orphans at St. Jean de Dieu, at St. Jean DIEU, were selected to receive electroshock, drugs, and other treatments, primarily based on whether or not they had immediate family members who might come to their defense or protection, said one source who worked at the facility. Rod Vanneau said Quebec psychiatrists viewed these children, who most often came from the province's poorest families, as unwanted. They emptied Quebec's orphanages using the Vatican, he said, sending the unwanted children to the psychiatric hospitals where psychiatrists could do any experiment that they wanted to do on these over 100,000 children. And no one would know. Evidence suggests that many boys and girls became victims of a psychiatric eugenics program with connections to prominent members of the U.S. and psychiatric establishments. Defectives was the sweeping label that Canadian psychiatrist Charles Kirk Clark, founder of the Canadian Mental Health Association, applied to immigrants from Eastern and Central Europe. Another Canadian eugenist, Helen McMurky, a provincial inspector of the feeble-minded, campaigned for sterilization to prevent certain mothers from filling the cradle with degenerate babies. I addressed this subject in a 1996 cover report in its Canadian edition entitled The Ethnic Cleansing of the Mentally Unfit, Sterilization in Canada. The authors wrote, tools of eugenists thus become immigration controls, birth control, sterilization, and finally euthanasia as carried out by the Nazis, noting that the first three methods had been employed in Canada, resulting in, among other things, the involuntary sterilizations of thousands of women, many of them Canadian, Indian, or other minorities. With fresh allegations now surfacing that many Duplessis orphans died or disappeared, the fourth item on the eugenics agenda, euthanasia, certainly warrants official investigation. Hahn's story then went on to charge that hundreds of innocent children were eventually killed maybe thousands, during these horrific experimentations. Indeed, the bodies of hundreds or even thousands of Duplessis orphans buried near Quebec psychiatric hospitals may today hold the key to documenting what survivors have called organized psychiatric genocide. Montreal attorney Daniel Leiter suggested that Quebec officials permit exhumation of bodies buried on hospital grounds to determine what extent orphans may have been used for psychiatric experimentation, including lobotomies, electroshock, and mass drugging. And these are just some of the stories, that this is what's come out. Can you imagine what's been else has been covered up? And so as we look back on the Duplessis orphans, I think it gives us another story to understand, the point we're trying to make on this show, that there's a connection between the Vatican, our government, and what's really going on in the world today. Now, I've said this many times, that if you don't, you're just whistling in the wind if you don't start putting the cards together. If you don't start putting these dots together and making these connections, you'll never see how they orchestrate wars, how they orchestrate really what's going on in the Middle East today. And according to credible researchers, not afraid to touch this Vatican connection, there is really no hope at saving any kind of freedom. And that's around the world, because they have a plan of a one-world government, one-world religion that's moving quickly. And you must expose this, no matter how hard it is. Now, ask yourself, why does the mainstream media and most of the alternative media and every single last politician on Capitol Hill avoid the Vatican connection like a plague? I remember when I tried to get Ron Paul to talk about this, he would not. Of course, at the time, Ron Paul wasn't as well known as many people. But he wouldn't go on certain shows. He'd go on most shows. But he definitely wasn't going to go on mine. And the reason he wasn't going to go on was because of many, many things he'd heard about me, and that's as far as trying to really not pull any punches when it came to the Vatican. And so even guys like him are covering up. Now, the reason why many truth-telling Christians give is that all roads lead to Rome. And people in positions of power in the media and government are paid to protect the real perpetrators of evil. Now, ask yourself why people like Bill O'Reilly, Rush Limbaugh, the CNN, MSNBC, commentators never mention stories like this. Ask why supposed friend of the people and presidential candidate Ron Paul, remember him? And others today that have taken his place, maybe his son, others, Cynthia McKinney, never mention the Vatican. Ask why big shot radio broadcasters in the alternative media, like Alex Jones, protect the Vatican. Furthermore, why don't people in Hollywood, Charlie Sheen, Rosie O'Donnell, others, who have supposedly come out for 9/11 truth, never mention the Vatican and Jesuit ties to, or any of the historical stories we mention, or anything? The reason is, if they did, they wouldn't be around. I remember one time I was driving through Los Angeles, and Charlie Sheen, or Martin Sheen, his father, was on a PBS show talking about 9/11 or something. And so I wanted to talk to him about the subject. And so instead of blindsiding him, I told the screener exactly what I was going to say and never was put on the air. That's enough to tell me. The reason is very simple why this goes on. The reason is they are all protecting them, especially the people in the know. Now, you could give them the benefit and the downside, well, they don't know. But I tend to think that people like them have an idea of what's going on. Now, furthermore, why won't any of the above-mentioned political and media figures at least enter into an intelligent debate about the Vatican's wealth, many of the things we talk about in this show, and control over foreign and domestic policy? Now, I've asked that question many times, and it's a very, very simple answer. And I remember one time people were talking, and here's what some people said about Alex Jones, about what's going on in the world regarding this. And I remember Phil Jahan commented. He said, and is Alex Jones unaware of all these allegations, many of them documented regarding Charlie Sheen? Is it possible Alex Jones is unaware of them? Is it possible that Charlie Sheen was chosen to come forth with these issues of 9/11 simply because he could not be so easily written off and discredited? Because of his testimony attracted more attention than they suspected it would, that these allegations would be brought and the tough questions asked, and who benefit directly from him coming forth? And he goes on and on to talk about why Vatican is never mentioned. And I remember another researcher came forward on my show and said, unfortunately, these guys, Alex Jones, is indeed involved with the Jesuits, or he has to be because he has to know this stuff. The detailed work he has performed and his many lower-level conclusions are absolutely correct. But when it comes to the grand question of who rules, he fades away into the woodwork, refusing to even mention the Vatican or the Jesuits. This keeps people agitated and produces the fear he seeks to induce. His intense facial expressions, his abrasive voice, and his obvious collusion and coadjutors of power, such as George Bush, Michael Moore, David Gergen, reveals his true part he has been ordered to perform. And person said, Tony Lamo has paid the price for resisting the order with his time in prison, but he remained faithful and is a great encouragement to many people. And that was written by a couple researchers talking about the Vatican. And so this big question comes up. Are we ever going to get to the bottom of these stories? Well, we do. We try on this show. And it really doesn't matter how many others follow suit, because we realize why they don't. Now, one other thing I wanted to get to, and that was what's going on in the Middle East today. And it appears to me that they're fomenting another huge war. And we've talked about it many times on this show. How wars are orchestrated, who's behind them, and we look at this and wonder, what can we do? Well, the point I'm trying to make is we have to go back into history, start looking at really what's happened, and then try and document it the best we can today, because in a sense, it's a difficult subject. I mean, how many people, when you start looking at what I'm talking about here, even know who some of these people are in the past? I mean, the history of, we go back and talk about Abraham Lincoln. We go back and talk about Hitler. We talk about all these stories where the Vatican has a connection that's been covered up. And it seems that, we could talk to the cows come home and nothing ever gets done. Now, I remember doing a story about Jesuit General Vladimir Ledikowski and his connections. He was the head of the Society of Jesus from 1915 to 1942. And he's from Poland. And when you see his connections to to the war and what went on, because, all the death camps were there. And you see how the Vatican was involved in establishing these death camps and looking at some of the occult symbols behind them. It's just incredible. And for anyone to say that they have changed is ridiculous. Oh, they've got a good PR campaign going on now. But there's nothing any different about them now than they were back in the 1940s, than they were back in the time of the 1500s. And the reason, you can even point it, that canon law has never changed. If you look, and I spent 7 years in Rome, so I spent a lot of time studying these guys and learning as I went along. And the real idea behind it was very simple. It taught me that you have a responsibility to understand the hierarchy of your governments, the country you live in, and also the hierarchy of the religion, especially that you are brought up in. And I happen to be brought up in the Catholic religion. Through that, I've learned much about many, many others. And the point is, it comes down to basically not listening to what's been told to you by these people. And it's the same scenario as don't listen to what the media is telling you. I chose to be a journalist and really felt that there was some truth. Well, there is. They're going to cover stories of, fires and things like that. Sure, they covered the news of the day. But when you really want to get down to the truth about what's going on in the world, you don't get anything from the mainstream media. And unfortunately, when I started, I had to learn the hard way. But through it all, there's one thing I want to leave you with, and that is, make sure that you really put these stories that we do on the show side by side with others and give them a fair shot. I'm not asking you to believe everything. I'm asking you at least to put it on the table of debate. With that, I'll say good night and see you tomorrow on the Investigative Journal.